Philosophers often talk about things called categories or things in terms of categories. So, what is it? Category is a term that refers to a fundamental class or kind of thing that helps us structure our understanding of the world. It often denotes the most basic concepts or types of being, thought, or language, those that cannot be reduced to anything more fundamental. And it's this fundamental aspect of it that's really important. When we're thinking in terms of categories, we want to get to the sort of absolute most base point about whatever it is that we're dealing with. So, categories come in themselves in different categories or different flavors. So, you have ontological categories, which kind of denote the basic kinds of being. They can be substance, property, and you'll find these in philosophers such as Hegel. Or they can be logical or conceptual categories, basic ways of thinking or classifying, particularly logically. So quality, quantity, cause, as in Aristotle, but also in Hegel and in Kant. Or epistemological categories, structures through which we interpret reality or create experience or are able to have an experience in the first place. So this you will find in Kant, but also in Hegel. So let's do a bit of history. We've got Aristotle to thank for the earliest and most influential uses of category, because he has a work called Categories, where he identifies 10 basic types of predicates, such as substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, and so forth. And these are meant to classify everything that can be said about an entity, helping us to understand basic ways in which things are or can be described. So, whatever it is you're dealing with or come across in the world, according to Aristotle, you will be able to pick out what that thing is in a structured and meaningful way through a or many categories. And so here you have a little bit of a screenshot of the table of categories that Aristotle comes up with. But following Aristotle, we have Kant, who does a bit of a radical shift in terms of thinking about categories. So in his philosophy, categories become a priori concepts of the understanding, which basically means they are mental structures that shape how we experience the world. Examples include causality, unity, plurality, necessity, etc., and so forth. So, rather than describing the world as it is, Kant's categories describe the conditions under which experience itself is possible. So we have come across a various plethora of objects that are meaningful to us, but they are exactly meaningful to us, right, as in our experience. So Kant sort of peels back our experience, which he takes as a matter of fact, but he makes like a logical argument that necessitates certain conditions that he thinks have to be there in order for us to have the kind of experience we're having, namely one in which we come across meaningful objects. So here is a pair of glasses, right? That there's a piece of metal here and another piece of metal there, right? What do these pieces of metal have to do with one another, right? One could make a physicalist argument that, well, they're bound in space and time and so forth, but that doesn't really make this out as an object, at least in terms of like a meaningful one, as in glasses, right? Because these are just bits of metal, they're just kind of randomly there. So them being together in some physical sense is not enough to make that object determinate. So for Kant, we do a lot of conceptual work, our minds do a lot of mental work in order to structure various sensuous data in meaningful ways, such as there are glasses here and Over here is a book, right? And we can distinctly, Kant thinks, figure out what those categories are and how they fit together. So he has a table of categories here. You've got nice grouping of quantity, quality, relations, and modality. And he thinks all of these, one or many of these, are at play whenever we have a meaningful object that we pick out in our experience or have an experience of, right? Let's move on to Hegel. Hegel uses categories as stages or logical structures in the unfolding of thought and reality through what's called a dialectical development. So his categories are more dynamic and developmental than Aristotle's or Kant. For Kant, he just has, same with Aristotle, the categories are just there and they're kind of static. Whereas in Hegel, he thinks, well, where do these categories come from? How are they picked out in the first place? Because the categories themselves aren't obvious. You have to do a lot of philosophical work to dig them out. And Hegel thinks that this digging out should be part of the account of the categories themselves, because they don't just fall out of the sky or are obvious or self-evident. So he thinks that philosophers have more to do in order to prove their conceptions of what it is we think, of how our experience is structured. So let's look at a bit of text from Hegel on this. So this is from the Phenomenology of Spirit, perhaps Hegel's most influential text. And we'll do a bit of close reading now. So buckle up. Okay, so quote, "Reason is the certainty of being all reality. However, this in itself, or this reality, is still for all intents and purposes a universal, the pure abstraction of reality. It is the first positivity in which self-consciousness is in itself as it is for itself, and thus the I is only the pure essentiality of existing, or the simple category. The category is this: self-consciousness and being are the same essence, or the same not in comparison with each other, but rather the same in and for itself." So the way Hegel kind of derives the idea of category in the phenomenology is from this shape of consciousness he calls reason. And reason starts out with having this certainty that all reality is rational. But the problem here is that, as he writes, it's still, for all intents and purposes, the pure abstraction of reality. Now, why is it an abstraction? We'll get into that in a little bit later. But for now, I just want us to focus on this idea that categories, for Hegel here, express self-consciousness and being in structured ways. As he goes on to say, quote, "Therefore to itself consciousness is at the same time a seeking to and fro, and its object is the pure in itself and the essence, and at another time to itself consciousness is the simple category, and the object is the movement of the differences." Basically, the point I want to get across is that the categories here aren't static, and they differentiate based on how consciousness is thinking about them. We start out with something simple, but that simplicity dissolves into a multitude of differences. But these are all differences of the same consciousness that is conscious of being, of itself and being, right? So we get into a multitude of categories, but all categories are essentially a reflection of the pure category, namely this essence whereby self-consciousness and being are the same, which, going back to the beginning of the paragraph that I was reading goes back to the idea that reason is the certainty of being all reality, which simply means, taking away the Hegelianism, or the Hegelese, it just means that consciousness understands reality to be rational. We understand that reality takes on a rational being. Now, rational for Hegel also needs to be qualified. Won't get into that here, but suffice to say, it isn't just something that's rule bound and follows a certain is the effect of a certain cause simply, right? It's more to do with how something can engender itself and come to be and takes part in a process that can be made explicit. So it's more alongside those things. So for Hegel, physics and movement of planets and rocks and sun and so forth, they are rational because they can be made explicit under laws and so on. But then life and then self-conscious life for Hegel would be still more rational forms, because these are more intelligent. They are the forms of rationality that can apprehend rationality around themselves. Animals do this, plants do this to some extent. They are able to intuit and feel their way and orient themselves around their world, and even like create a world. And then all of this becomes like multiplied with human beings, right? Because we're beings that are questioning our own being, and things are not transparent to us. So all of this thinking has to be sort of entailed in at this philosophical level. Per Hegel's idealism, categories are both regarded in their own right and as conceptions of reality and moments of self-consciousness. It is self-consciousness that thinks about reality as rational, right? So we think about reality as intelligent, and consequently self-consciousness is mirrored in reality, just as reality contains the being that it is that is conscious of it and thinks of this relation. So it quickly becomes lots of sort of meta steps on top of this that philosophers have got to keep track of. I alluded to a problem and that we see here in the opening. Now, why is this an abstraction? The certainty of why does Hegel think this is an abstraction, that we think that, well, reality is rational, right? And it can be made explicitly rational. Well, the problem is that this is, for now, an assumption. It's a certainty. You take it for granted that it is rational, but it hasn't really shown itself to be rational. And this spurs the development of the phenomenology at this stage, whereby reason starts to observe reason in reality. And that's where you get into sort of the typical empirical science stuff, like just observing nature, finding reason in nature, in animals, in life, and then in psychology and so on, right? So Hegel goes through all these different steps where he shows or deals with ways of figuring out how reality is rational, starting with the most immediate object. So presently, the issue is that this idea of category, as we've discovered, remains abstract when regarded only in its immediacy. Truth isn't just given. Certainty is given, right? You are certain the table is here, but how much of a table is it really? Why isn't it a mirage or kind of a fake table? As soon as you put some weight on it, the table collapses. How do you know that's not the case, right? So, quote, thus, in order to reach this other which is essential to it, which is to say, in fact, to reach the in itself, which is this pure reason, which this pure reason does not have within itself, the pure reason of this idealism is through itself returned to that knowing which is not a knowing of the true. In doing so, it condemns itself knowingly and voluntarily to being untrue knowing, and it cannot divest itself of that kind of meaning something and perceiving, neither of which has any truth for it itself. So Hegel goes into this interesting experience that probably many of us have had, is that we know something to not be true, and we despair. And we despair especially of ourselves, of our knowledge not being up to the task. So Hegel recognizes that this is something that occurs within self-consciousness and within dialectic, and in a sense with reason, right? It isn't just an accident, but it's from that despair that rationality and truth become possible. Because the certainty needs to be there, a certainty needs to be there, something needs to be claimed and established for then reason to work on and correct itself. And in doing so, gain the conception of what's going on, right? Conceptual development and dialectical. So for Hegel here then, conceptual development, a dialectic becomes necessary, a dynamic unfolding of an initial determination into a concept proper, as I was saying. Quote, however, actual reason itself is not so inconsistent. Rather, as only the certainty of being all reality, it is aware within this concept that as certainty, as the I, it is not yet reality in truth, and it is thus driven to raise its certainty into truth, and to fulfill the empty mind. So the empty mind that Hegel refers to here is something I omitted from the citation, but it's to do with the certainty of being all reality, whereby not just is consciousness seeing all of reality as rational, but it's seeing it as, kind of in its possession, in the sense that it can be grasped and explained and forms a part of it, forms a part of its self. And initially this is all just empty, or it has yet to prove itself to be so. So that's just giving you a little bit of an idea of what's really required in the demand Hegel puts on Kant and Aristotle when it comes to categories. Because these things that we refer to as fundamental classes or kinds of things that help us structure our understanding of the world themselves need to be accounted for. How they come about. What's the argument or reasoning for how we come to pick out and have meaningful things in the world. We can sort of haphazardly come across certain things. But in philosophy, we try to be more precise about where those structures or classes or ways of being are from, and whether they really differentiate something, whether they say something meaningful, or if they're not just various illusions or tautologies. Okay, so hopefully that whets your appetite on categories in philosophy. You can see that there's a lot of work involved in figuring out not just the structure of our understanding of the world, but the structure of understanding our structure of our understanding of the world. So, thanks very much for listening, and have a good day.